I noticed it on the line from Davos to Philosure early in the morning, when the sun was just beginning to color the sky. That first light that isn't yet light, but the promise of light. It was winter, December, and it was bitterly cold outside. So cold that the world felt as though it might freeze solid. -15 degrees, perhaps colder. I sat alone in the compartment, warm under my blanket, and I saw something on the window. I saw ice crystals. Small, delicate crystals, so fine you'd think an artist had painted them with a brush. They were white, very white, gleaming and milky all at once, and they covered the lower part of the window completely, where the cold pressed in most strongly, where the world tried to get inside. The crystals hadn't formed by chance. They were the result of nights, of many cold, long nights, when the air outside fell below -10 degrees, below -15, perhaps lower. The difference, the tension between the cold outside world and the warm air inside the train maintained by the heating, that created this work of art, this frost. The window was like a painting from another world, as though you were looking into another planet, a planet of ice and light. The crystals were so delicate, so perfect, as though an artist had sat here all night and painted every line. And yet, they weren't fragile. That was the wonder of it. They looked delicate, but they were hard as steel. I touched the glass with my finger, very lightly, carefully, as though I were touching a sleeping child. And I felt the cold. Such intense cold. A cold that penetrated the thin glass, pierced through my flesh, and reached my heart. The glass was icy, impossibly cold, and the crystals didn't melt, although my finger was warm. They were too persistent, too solid, too coherent. They weren't delicate, they were strong. They were the symbol of winter itself, fixed, unchangeable, beautiful. A beauty that arises from resistance, from the rejection of warmth, from the stubbornness of ice. I looked at the mountain landscape outside, and it was completely snow-covered. The mountains of Davos and Philosure in this part of Switzerland, those mountains were white, completely white. The snow lay thick upon them, and the trees were also white, their branches covered in snow, as though an artist had poured white paint over them. It was still. It was so still that you could hear the wheels of the train running over the rails. It was the stillness of winter, the stillness of a place where nothing could grow anymore, I thought, while I stared at the frost, at these endless patterns, about how a life takes shape, how frost forms on a window very slowly, molecule by molecule, crystal by crystal. You need the cold outside, you need the warmth inside, you need the difference, you need the tension between the two. The tension that has no resolution, only a balance, a dance. And then something beautiful grows. Then a pattern appears, a unique pattern. Then a life becomes a work of art. Not because it's perfect, not because it's without flaw, but because it's true, because it's real, because it shows the essence of difference, the beauty that arises from conflict. The train travels deeper into the mountains. The track winds like a serpent, and the windows change their direction after every curve. I see new mountains, new snowfields, new landscapes. Every window shows a new view, but each tells the same story. And on every window I look at, I see the same frost, the same crystals, the same work of art. That's the wonder of winter, that nature keeps painting the same picture again and again, again and again, every night. And it's never the same. Every crystal is different. Every frost pattern is unique. Never is a pattern exactly repeated. Nowhere in the world are there two frost windows that are identical. Winter, I think, is a teacher. Winter teaches through stillness. While summer is loud, full of movement, full of life and noise and change, winter is still. Winter reduces, subtracts, takes away everything that isn't essential. All the green becomes brown or white. All the animals hide. People go outside less. And in this stillness, in this reduction, the beautiful becomes clearer. A single snowflake on my window becomes a miracle because everything else is gone. Complexity becomes simplicity, and simplicity is full of beauty. I lean my head against the window and feel the cold. I feel the frost. I feel the difference between my warm forehead and the cold pane. That's the point where the crystals form. That's the boundary, the threshold, the transition from one state to another. And perhaps that's what life is, a constant transition, a constant boundary between inner desires and outer reality. And in this boundary, in this point of tension, something is born, something new, something beautiful. Something that has never existed before and will never exist again exactly in this way. I thought of the people who live in these regions, who see this beauty every day, every winter. They live in Davos, in Filisur, in these mountain villages. They see this frost every winter. They see these crystals every year. And perhaps they don't notice it anymore. Perhaps it's just a window to them, just a pane of glass that you can wipe clean if you want to look out, if you want to see the view. The window becomes an obstacle. But perhaps some of them see it sometimes, in a quiet moment, in a moment of attention, these crystals. And perhaps they recognize in them what I recognize. Life, beauty, fragility, the ephemeral, the eternal, which lasts only for a moment. I touched the crystals again, more carefully this time, with the back of my finger. They were hard, stronger than I'd expected, as though I were touching stone, not something that formed from water and air and cold. But when I looked closely, I could see the structure. Each small crystal wasn't simply a random shape. They formed patterns, symmetries, little arms that spread out like trees, like ferns, like the veins of a leaf. And I understood. This is not chance. This is chemistry. This is physics. But it's also art. Nature paints on this window, and it paints with mathematical precision, with artistic instinct. Nobody had made these crystals. Nobody told nature how they should look. And yet, they're perfect. And I thought, that is life. That is the beauty of life. Beauty doesn't arise when you try to force it. It arises when you hold two opposing forces in tension, the cold outside and the warmth inside, the frost and the sun, death and life. And in this tension, in this constant dance between opposites, something indescribably beautiful arises, something that's mathematical and at the same time mystical, something that lasts only for a moment and therefore is precious, is fleeting, is sacred. And if you understand that, if you accept the beauty of the fleeting, then you understand the essence of life itself. The train approached Filisur, slowing down as the mountain landscape grew wider. The sun was now higher in the sky, and the light grew warmer, more intense, and the window with its crystals began to melt. Very slowly, very gently, like a person waking up. The white patterns disappeared, first at the edges, then in the middle. The work of art dissolved, transformed back into water droplets, into nothing. The difference between inside and outside grew smaller, and the temperature The temperature began to even out, and the crystals that had been there so long, that were so artfully made, became invisible. They lived no longer. That was the fate of frost. That was its life. Brief, beautiful, fleeting, like all beautiful things. And then it was gone, and the window was just glass again, transparent glass, and the world out there was just snow, white, endless, still. I met the calligrapher on the Weimar-Erfurt route in autumn, when the leaves are red and gold, and she carried her tools with her like a soldier his precious armor, but with a gentle, loving, almost protective tenderness. Her name was Lena, and her hands were stained with ink, dark blue, black-brown, as if she carried not one but several whole rivers in her hands, years of ink, years of writing. "I've done this work," she said to me, not with pride, but with a kind of spiritual humility, for as long as I can remember. Beautiful scripts, old scripts, ancient calligraphy, the wonderful art of not simply writing words, but making them into pictures, into little artworks. My grandmother taught me when I was 6 years old, and her grandmother taught her, and so it goes back and back and back through time, through history. She showed me her hands. They weren't young anymore, no, they were old, but they were alive, full of quiet strength, full of history. Every line I write, every single day, it's a life, a small existence, a tiny breath in the great universe. Every curve is a prayer, a real prayer, a communication with something greater than myself, with beauty itself, with eternity. And the ink, oh, the ink, it's not simply black. The ink is the soul of the word. The ink is the blood of the script. The ink is the bridge between my thoughts and the thoughts of the person reading it. The ink is the medium of love. The ink is immortal. Lena told me very detailed and lovingly about her work. How you hold the brush correctly, where you apply pressure, how you mix the ink to get the perfect consistency, how you write words, not quickly, not hastily, not hurriedly, but slowly, very slowly, treating every single letter lovingly, respectfully, as if speaking with the great and holy, as if communicating with love itself. Calligraphy, she said, her old eyes lighting up with inner joy, is not simply a craft, a practical skill. It's meditation, pure and complete meditation. You don't write to be fast, not to achieve efficiency, not to complete a task. You write to be completely and wholly present, to place yourself entirely in this moment, to become one with the brush, the ink, the paper, and the word. You write to honor the word, to create beauty, to tell the universe that beauty isn't simply beautiful. Beauty is important. Beauty is sacred. Beauty is the true work. She opened a small, artfully old wooden box and showed me individual pages, sheets she'd written over the decades. Poems by Goethe and Hölderlin, prayers from Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, individual sacred words like love, hope, eternity, all incredibly beautiful, all made with infinite, relentless care and love, without hurry, without impatience. Only love, only dedication. I asked Lena where she finds the inspiration for her words, and she looked at me with a gaze full of understanding. Everywhere, she said. In a flower, in a child's face, in a tear I see when someone looks at my words, in a sunset, in a falling leaf. Inspiration isn't something you search for. It's everywhere. It waits for you. It breathes in everything. I'm just an instrument. The brush is the instrument. The ink is the instrument. My hand is the instrument. But the inspiration, that doesn't come from me. That comes from something much greater, from something eternal, from something that connects all people to each other through words and beauty. "Over the years," said Lena quietly, very quietly, as if entrusting me with a great secret. "With decades of daily work, with thousands of pages, with millions of strokes, I finally understood very late in my life that calligraphy isn't simply a craft, not simply a traditional art form or a practical skill. It's a real language, a real communication, a language between you and the word itself, between you and the divine, between you and eternity, between mortal and immortal. Every single stroke I make, every single stroke I place with my brush and ink on the paper, it remains forever. It won't be erased, not forgotten, not overwritten, not replaced by a computer. It will live on in the eyes of people who read it and regard it with wonder, in their hearts that feel touched, in their dreams at night, in their prayers." And she was silent, and I saw tears in her old eyes. And Lena opened her bag and showed me her tools. They weren't modern, not new, but old, very old. Some of them were from her grandmother, some from her great-great-grandmother. "These brushes," she said, "they have 100 years of writing on their back, 100 years, and I'm just one in a long chain. I'm not the beginning and not the end. I'm just a part of this great story of beauty." She held a brush in the lights of the train, and I saw how light shimmed through the fine hairs, how colors played. "Every brush," she said, "carries within it the souls of all the women who held it before me. And when I take it in my hand, I'm not just taking a brush, but a whole tradition, a whole line of loving women who all did what I do." "People today," said Lena, and there was a hint of sadness in her voice, "they no longer know what true beauty is. They want fast, they want cheap, they want much in little time. But beauty, true beauty, you can't make quickly. It needs time, it needs patience, it needs love. And if you don't have love, if you're not willing to spend hours on a single letter, then you can't create true beauty." She looked directly at me, and her eyes were very intense, very old, very wise. "That's my mission in my last years, to show that slowness is valuable, that patience is valuable, that beauty is valuable." Lena took my arm very gently and showed me her fingers again in the light of the train lamps. "Do you see these stains?" she asked. "They're not just ink stains, it's not just dirt. It's my life written on my hands. Every stain is a word I've written. Every stain is a moment when I was present, when with my brush I changed the world a little, just a bit, just for one person, but changed it. And these stains will never come off. They've become part of me forever. And when I die, when these hands finally rest, the stains will also rest, but not the words. The words will live on in people's homes, in their hearts, forever." The train traveled on through the deep autumn night, through Saxony, through Germany, and Lena leaned back against the window, her eyes slowly growing heavy, peaceful, completely relaxed. "My hands won't be able to work much longer," she said quietly, but without sadness or complaint or fear. Just a neutral, accepted statement, a truth she'd understood long ago. "The arthritis will soon be too much, too painful. Soon these hands won't be able to hold the brush, but..." And she made a long pause while the train rattled on. "But the words I've written over my whole life, all the thousands of pages, they will be beautiful forever. They'll hang in homes and be kept in libraries, in the hearts and hands of people I'll never meet, who perhaps live hundreds of years after me. And that's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything a person needs. That's true immortality. The immortality a mortal craftsperson can have. The only immortality a person really needs. And Lena closed her eyes, and I saw she was smiling. A quiet, contented smile. And now, in this night, while the train travels, while I approach sleep, when I think of the calligrapher, when I remember her old, gentle voice, her attitude of patience, her dedication, I see her fine, ink-stained hands before me, see the dark blue ink sitting between her fingernails, see the beautiful words dancing like little living artworks on the page, breathing, gleaming, singing. And I slowly fall asleep to a rhythm that sounds like the slow, gentle, precise writing of a brush, like a prayer, like a meditation, like the beating of a quiet heart, gently, carefully, forever, immortal, warm and safe in the beauty of script. I met the tinsmith on the Augsburg-Memmingen route on a cold winter evening when the sun had long since set, and he still bore the stains and scars of his long work on his clothes, small gray stains, gray ash, as if the tin itself over decades penetrated his fabric, became part of him. His name was Wilhelm, and he was an old man, perhaps 70, perhaps older, and his eyes were very shrewd, very quiet, very deep, the eyes of someone who dedicated his whole life to the same work. "The tinsmith," said Wilhelm to me, not without bitterness, but without complaint. "That's a dying craft, a craft that's slowly dying. For many years now, since the first war perhaps. But I can't stop. I don't know how to stop. My grandfather was a tinsmith in Augsburg. My father was a tinsmith, and I'm the last in my family, the very last tinsmith of the Wilhelm family." He showed me his hands very slowly, and they were stained with tin, gray, bearing the marks of 100 years of work, but with an extraordinary gentleness, a tenderness in the movements that only comes from 60 years of daily experience, only from a whole existence dedicated to this metal. Wilhelm told me very detailed about his workshop in Augsburg, a small workshop that had held the same place for generations, how he forms the tin, how he melts it in the blowtorch, how he pours it into molds, how he taps it with hammers, how he gives life to the dead, formless metal, gives it soul, gives it beauty. "The tin," said Wilhelm, and his voice became full of love, "is not as noble as gold, not as rare, but it has another, deeper kind of beauty. It has the beauty of the simple, of the everyday, of the humble, of the true. A silver cup made of tin, a bowl of tin, a spoon of tin. That's not something for the rich and powerful. It's not something for kings. That's something for ordinary people, for farmers, for craftspeople, for the poor. And that's exactly what makes it valuable. That's exactly what makes it precious. That's exactly what makes it sacred." I asked Wilhelm how it feels to work with a metal that isn't valuable, a material people don't dream of, don't inherit, don't keep as treasure. And he looked at me with an expression of deep understanding. "That's exactly the point," he said. "Gold, silver, these materials invite people to think of value, of wealth, of vanity. But tin? Tin forces you to see beauty in simplicity. It forces you to forget yourself. You don't work for fame or for admiration. You work purely to create beauty, to bring joy to the lives of ordinary people. That's real meditation, real spiritual work. That's alchemical work, not in gold, but in the soul." "Over the years," said Wilhelm, and he looked out the window at the dark landscape passing by. "Over decades, I slowly learned, very slowly, that the best, the deepest, the most beautiful work is work that's never noticed, never praised. The bowl or the plate I make with my hands, they're beautiful, truly beautiful. But people don't see the beauty. They just see the plate. They use it, they wash it, they put it in the cupboard. They don't know that beauty is there, that I worked 100 hours on that plate. And that's all right. That's even better that way. Beauty doesn't need to be seen, doesn't need to be praised. Beauty can simply be there, still, quiet, humble, forever, waiting, serving, loving. The train traveled on through the deep winter night, and Wilhelm leaned back against the window. His eyes grew tired. "Tomorrow," he said quietly. "Tomorrow I'll close the workshop. After 60 years. My whole life was there. And I don't know how I'll bear that, how I'll live without that workshop. The tin was my whole life, my whole existence, my whole reason to exist. But I'm too old now. My hands tremble, my eyes are weak. The time is over." And I saw he wasn't sad, not embittered, just tired, just very tired, but also ready, somehow ready to let go. "The objects I made," said Wilhelm, and his voice was very quiet, very tender. "The bowls, the plates, the chalices, the spoons, they'll outlast me for a long time. Tin bowls that are 200 years old, they'll still be valuable, still beautiful, will still be used. And that's enough for a mortal person. That's more than enough. That's true immortality. The immortality of a simple craftsperson. The immortality of serving." And Wilhelm opened a small wooden box and showed me some of the objects he'd created over the decades. An old chalice, perhaps 40 or 50 years old, gray, silvered, with tiny hammer marks all over it that showed a human hand, with great dedication and patience, had created it. A small bowl, barely larger than a palm, with an engraved name and date. A tin cutlery set, worn by 100 years of use, but still beautiful, still delicate, still valuable. "These objects," said Wilhelm quietly, holding them like small, precious birds, "aren't famous. They're not in big museums. They're in homes somewhere, in strange homes I don't know. They're used, perhaps every day. They're loved. They're passed down from generation to generation. And that's the best, the most beautiful existence an object can have. It's not in a museum, trapped, untouchable, dead. It lives, it's needed, it's touched, it's loved." "The beauty of tin," said Wilhelm, and I saw his eyes come alive again, become young again, "is exactly that it's not perfect. Gold must be perfect. Silver must be perfect. But tin can be irregular, can bear the marks of the hand, can be imperfect, can be human. And that's exactly what makes it beautiful. That's exactly what makes it true. The hand of the artist is visible in every circle, in every dent. The work is visible. The human is visible. And that's truth. That's beauty that doesn't lie, that doesn't deceive, that is simply what it is." Wilhelm opened his notebook, an old hand-bound book with sketches of objects he'd made over decades. Chalices, jugs, small bowls, cutlery, hundreds of designs, all different, all drawn by one hand with clear, precise lines. "Every object begins here," he said, and pointed to a sketch. "Here, in my head, with a pencil. I already see the object before I make it. I see how it gleams, how the light plays on the surfaces, how it feels in the hands, how it'll outlast generations. And then I just try to create what I see in my head. It's like a prayer, you understand? Every object is a prayer to beauty itself, a small plea to the universe that it allows simplicity and beauty to go together." And Wilhelm told me about a very special chalice he made many, many years ago for a poor family that needed something beautiful and precious for a wedding, something that would represent the eternity of their love. "I worked 3 months on that chalice," he said, and I saw tears in his eyes. 3 months for people who weren't wealthy, who had little money. But I wanted to give them the best, give them the most beautiful. And when I finished it, when I polished it with a very fine file, when it finally gleamed as if the light itself penetrated the tin, then I knew that all this work, this whole life, my whole life, that was it. A single chalice for a single family, for a single wedding, for a single love. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything I ever needed. And now, in this night, while the train slowly travels through the German landscape, while I listen to this old, wise man I'll never see again, when I think of Wilhelm, when I remember his hands stained with tin and life, I think of all the silver tin objects he created over his whole life, over 60 years, the thousands of plates and bowls and chalices and spoons and containers that are now in strange homes, that are used, that are loved. I think of the quiet, gentle, true beauty of the simple, of the true, of the serving, of the loving. And I slowly fall asleep with the weight of tin in my heart, warm, firm, heavy, true, eternal, unforgotten. I met the umbrella maker on the Lyon-Chambéry route on a rainy autumnal night, and she carried an umbrella that was old, very old, but absolutely perfectly maintained, made of red silk with small yellowish patterns, as if autumn had been sewn into the umbrella. And she told me calmly that she'd made this umbrella herself 40 years ago and had carried it with her ever since. Her name was Margot, a French woman from Lyon, and her hands were thin, pale, but very industrious, full of fine movements, full of patience. "An umbrella," said Margot to me, as she opened and closed her umbrella in a gentle, rhythmic movement, "is not simply a practical tool against the rain, nothing simple. An umbrella is a work of art, a masterpiece. Its functionality and beauty together, united, not separate. The fabric must be water-resistant, must repel water, but it must also be beautiful, must delight the eyes, must uplift the soul. The frame, made of wood or metal, must be stable, must withstand the wind, must last years, but it must also be elegant, must look beautiful. The handle must be comfortable, must sit pleasantly in the hand, but also be beautiful to hold, beautiful to look at." She opened her umbrella, and the structure was absolutely perfect. The silk was still alive, still delicate. The mechanism worked smoothly after 40 years. Margot told me with great detail about her workshop in Lyon, that famous city of silk and beauty. How you make umbrellas, how you cut the silk fabric precisely, not a millimeter too much. How you sew the silk carefully, stitch by stitch. How you assemble the structure, how you shape the handle, how you bring it all together into a single, beautiful object. "It's very complex work," she said thoughtfully. "There are many steps, many movements, much concentration. But when you do it for years, when you do it with true love, with dedication, then it becomes meditation. Then it's not just technical work. The umbrella becomes not just an object, a thing. The umbrella becomes part of your soul, carries your love, carries your business, becomes a small world. "There's a philosophy of umbrelling," said Margot, and it was clear this was something she'd thought about long and carefully. It's not simple to make an umbrella. You must understand that the umbrella protects you, that it's a kind of roof over you, that it's the boundary between you and the outside world. And this boundary must be beautiful, must be respectful, must be strong. A cheap umbrella is not just a cheap umbrella. A cheap umbrella tells the world that you're not important, that your protection isn't important, that your beauty isn't important. But a handmade umbrella, a good umbrella, that says you're worth protecting beautifully. "Over the years," said Margot, and her voice became very quiet, very gentle, very dreamy. "Over decades, I slowly saw that people no longer wanted handmade umbrellas. Not really. They wanted cheap, quick, simple umbrellas made of plastic and cheap silk, mass-produced from China, made in minutes, without love. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't lower the quality. I couldn't abandon my standards. I still made every umbrella as if it were my last, as if it were my masterpiece, my masterwork." She looked directly at me, and her eyes were quiet, old, tired, but also full of grace, full of understanding, full of peace. She opened her old bag and took out various materials, fabrics, wires, small wooden frames. "You see," she said, her thin fingers running over the materials like a pianist over a keyboard. "At the beginning, I had to cut everything by hand, no machines, a large, sharp knife, a cutting ruler made of wood, a steady hand. Every cut had to be perfect. 1 millimeter too much, and the fabric doesn't fit. The umbrella becomes uneven, the rain won't drain properly. So much work for the smallest mistake. But that's craftsmanship. That's the price of perfection. You learn to work very slowly. You learn to pay attention. You become one with the material, one with every cut, every seam." "My father was also an umbrella maker," said Margot, and her voice was full of nostalgia, full of warm memory. "He worked in Lyon, in a large workshop with other craftspeople, in the 20s, in the 30s. He taught me everything. He told me that an umbrella is a very intimate object. It sits close to your head. It protects your face. It's like a helmet, but more beautiful, more elegant. And therefore, the umbrella must not only function, it must know you. It must adapt to your height, your movements, your style. A cheap umbrella is like a prison. A good umbrella is like an extension of yourself, like your second self, your second face." "The rain," said Margot, and I saw a smile on her face. "Is not evil, is not the enemy. The rain is beautiful. The rain is cleansing. The rain is part of nature. And a good umbrella, a good handmade umbrella, lets you enjoy the rain without getting wet, without worrying. A good umbrella doesn't just keep you dry. A good umbrella makes you happy, makes you smile even when it's raining hardest. That's the power, the magic of good, loving craftsmanship, of true work." She leaned her head against the train window, where the rain was now growing stronger, drops upon drops against the glass. "When I make an umbrella from silk," she said dreamily, "I hear the rain on the umbrella. Every material has its own sound, its own tone when the rain falls. Red silk sounds different from blue silk. Fine silk sounds different from thick. And these tones, this music, it's part of the artwork. A good umbrella must not only look beautiful, must not only function, but also sound beautiful. The rain is a concert, and the umbrella is the instrument. And if you make the umbrella correctly, if you choose the right silk, then every rainy day becomes a private symphony. And Margot leaned back, and she looked tired, old, but also fulfilled, as if she'd shared an important secret. The train traveled on through the night, through France, through dark landscapes, and I saw the rain continued, drops striking against the train's window. And Margot showed me a few other umbrellas, old masterpieces she carried in her large, overstuffed bag. Old umbrellas, classics she'd made over the years, and each was different, unique, unmistakable. Each bore the signature of its creator. Each had its own small story, its own small soul, its own small world. These umbrellas, she said thoughtfully as she leafed through them like a book, aren't very valuable in money, not hundreds of euros, perhaps 40, 50 euros. Very cheap for the hours I invested. But they're immensely valuable in love, in care, in time, in dedication. They're living records of my life, records of my hands, my eyes, my thoughts, my dreams, my hopes over decades. Every umbrella is a diary entry. Every umbrella is a prayer. And now, in this night, as I sleep on the train, as the rain outside strikes against the windows, when I think of Margot, this old Frenchwoman with her thin hands and her red umbrella, when I see how it rains, how drops gently fall from the sky, drop after drop, I think of an umbrella of perfect construction, of geometric elegance, of silk fabric, warm, lively silk, of the fine, precise seams, each a small prayer, of the clever hands that made it, of the love, deep love that lives in every umbrella, that breathes in every fiber. And I imagine enjoying the rain under a good handmade umbrella, warm, safe, dry, protected by the dedication of a craftswoman, an artist, a woman, a Frenchwoman, who always, always refused to lower quality, to lower love, to abandon care. I'm at the Broommaker on the line between Rosenheim and Kufstein on a warm spring evening when the first blossoms were beginning to show. He smelled strongly of straw, of earth, of all the natural things, of spring, and of 100 years of handcraft carried in the grain of his being. His name was Franz, an old Austrian, perhaps 80 years old, and his hands were stained dark brown and gray from decades of binding, of weaving, of the concentrated labor that filled his days, year after year, the same thoughtful actions repeated 1,000 times over. "The Broommaker," Franz said to me, not with sorrow, but with a kind of weary acceptance. "It's a whole trade, an entire craft that died slowly when the factory brooms came along in the 60s, the 70s. The big factories began turning out brooms, cheap, quick, without any love in them. But I couldn't stop. I didn't know how to stop. My father was a broommaker in Austria, and his father before him, and his father before that, back and back and back through time. It's not simply in my blood, not just in my hands. It's my whole life, my entire existence." He showed me his hands very slowly, and they were covered with fine scars, with calluses, with the marks of decades of weaving, of daily binding, of endless work. Each scar a little story, each callus a year of labor. Franz told me in great detail about his craft, how you gather the very best straw, how you dry it in the sun, how you bind it with special cord, how you weave it together with precision, form after form, until you have a broom, a good broom, a beautiful one. "A proper broom," he said, his eyes showing real passion. "It's not a simple thing. A good broom must be sturdy, must not break, must last for years and years. But it also must be flexible, must fit comfortably in your hand, must feel gentle. The straw strands must be bound very firmly, but they mustn't snap or scratch. It's a fine balance, you see, like everything in life, like everything in nature." Over the years, Franz said, gazing out the train window at the Austrian mountains. Over decades, I've made thousands of brooms, thousands upon thousands of them. And for me, each one mattered. Each one was a little work of art. Each one a small meditation. Each one a small prayer. But people, they don't see that. They see just a broom, a useful tool for sweeping, an object you buy for a few euros. They don't see the work behind it, the hours, the decades, the love. The Broommaker's work, Franz said, his voice growing very quiet and tender. It's silent work, unnoticed work, that nobody pays attention to. It's not honored, not praised, not paid fairly for what it's truly worth, for all those hours of labor. But it is necessary, it is important, it is essential. It's the foundation of order itself. A good broom, a handmade broom of proper straw, a good broom makes the daily work of cleaning, of sweeping, something pleasant. It makes life more beautiful, makes your home more beautiful every single day. It gives you joy, it gives you pride in your hands when you're sweeping, when you see how quickly and elegantly the broom works. That's the power of a good broom, the magic of a handmade tool. And he looked at me directly, intensely, young eyes in an old man's face, and they were deep brown, ancient but alive, full of understanding, full of wisdom, full of genuine love for his craft, for the trade he'd lived his whole life long. Franz also showed me a broom he'd made many years ago, a very old one, still functional, still beautiful, and he explained the details, how the straw strands had been chosen, how the binding had been done, how each layer had been a small meditation. I worked 2 days on this broom, he said. 2 days. And what did they pay me? Perhaps 5 euros. But I knew that broom would last 50 years, perhaps longer. And in those 50 years, it would improve people's lives, would make their homes more beautiful, would bring them joy every day. The straw, Franz said, showing me the individual blades he still carried in his pocket. It must grow in a particular forest, not just anywhere. The soil, the altitude, the rainfall, it all matters. I've lived long enough to know where the finest straw grows. A few villages from me, in the mountains, there's a field. And in that field grows the straw I need. The straw my father needed. The straw his father needed. For 100 years or more, straw from that same field, and I go there in early autumn when the straw is ripe, golden, dry. I cut it with my own hands, not with a machine, with an old sickle that belonged to my grandfather. I gather it, dry it, store it very carefully. He looked out the window at the mountains, and his eyes grew watery, luminous, full of sorrow and love. Next year, he said very quietly, I won't be able to go for the straw. The farmers have already told me they're selling the field. It's going to be a car park, a motorway, something modern. And then he stopped and was silent for a long moment. Then there will be no more straw, and the broommaker's tradition, it will come to an end. Not because people don't want brooms anymore, but because the sources dry up. Because the old nature, the natural world, it's disappearing, and with it goes the tradition, the craft, the whole life that's bound to it. And Franz leaned back against the window, and he was silent for a long, deep moment. Nothing but the rattle of the train, nothing but the night. There is a beauty, he said softly, his voice barely audible. A real, deep beauty in silent labor, in work that goes unpraised, that isn't famous, that never makes the newspapers. The beauty isn't in recognition, isn't in fame. The beauty is in the work itself, in each strand of straw, in every knot, in the worker's hands. That's the true wisdom I've learned in my whole life as a broommaker. And Franz told me, too, the kind of wise sadness that the broommaker's tradition, hundreds, perhaps thousands of years old, a very ancient European craft, will end in his lifetime, in his death. After him, there will be no more broommakers in Austria, no more craft, no more knowledge, no living connection to the past will be severed. My son, he said, he didn't want to take up the trade, didn't want to carry on the tradition. And I understand that. The world has grown faster, much faster. People want cheap brooms from China, cheap mass production, quantity instead of quality, speed instead of beauty, forgetting instead of remembering. And there was deep sorrow in his voice, but also understanding of the world, also peace with this ending, also acceptance that all things pass away, that all things die, that even the most beautiful traditions must fade. And now, in this night, as the train moves slowly through the Austrian landscape, as I drift toward sleep, as Franz drifts toward sleep. When I think of Franz and his craft, when I see an old, worn broom in the corner of a house, I think of the individual strands, each one separately. I think of the structure, the stability, the strength, and I think of the clever old hands, the wisdom, the patience that bound them together year after year, decade after decade, without real recognition, without fair payment for all those hours, only from love of the craft, only from love of beauty, only from tradition. And when I hold a good broom, when I sweep the dust away, when I see how elegant and efficient it works, I sweep with great care, with great respect, with great understanding, deeply grateful for the silent, unpraised, honest work of a craftsman, an artist, whose name I never learned, but whose labor, whose love, whose sacrifice I finally see now, finally understand, finally honor. I met the weaver on a train through Maramuresh in northern Romania, where the mountains are gentle and the valleys green, and the villages look as though time has forgotten them. The train was old and slow, one of those that stops at every halt, even when no one gets on or off, as though honoring the place. Outside, wooden houses slipped past with carved gates and tall haystacks in the gardens, and women in colorful costumes standing at the roadside watching the train, without waving, simply watching, quiet and matter-of-fact. She was an old woman, in her mid-80s perhaps, with a face full of wrinkles, all pointing upwards, as though she'd laughed more than she'd wept in her life. Her eyes were dark and awake, and round her head she wore a white cloth embroidered at the edges with red and blue patterns. Her hands rested on a bundle in her lap, a rolled piece of cloth that she held as though it were precious, and her fingers sometimes moved slightly, very gently, as though spinning invisible threads, as though she couldn't help herself. We began to talk, slowly, in a mixture of Romanian and German, which she spoke remarkably well, because, as a young woman, she'd once worked in Austria, in a weaving mill in Vorarlberg, before returning home to her village, to her loom, to the patterns her grandmother had taught her, and her grandmother before that. She unrolled the bundle in her lap and showed me the cloth, a table runner, finely woven, in red and black and white, with patterns that looked like stars and flowers and mountains all at once, depending on how you looked at them. 60 years, she said, and her voice was soft and melodious, like a song you hum without noticing. 60 years I've sat at the loom, every day except Sundays, because Sunday belongs to God, not to thread. My loom is made of wood, very old. My great-grandfather built it, and it creaks and groans like an old man. But it does its work, still does, faithful and patient, like a good friend. She told me what it sounds like when you weave. It's like music, she said. The clack of the shafts when you lift and lower them, the whoosh of the shuttle as it flies through the warp, back and forth, back and forth. The soft tap of the reed when you push the thread in place. Clack, whoosh, tap, clack, whoosh, tap. Again and again, for hours. It's like a heartbeat, you see. Like the heartbeat of the fabric being born under your hands, thread by thread, row by row, until something emerges from nothing. Something you can touch, something that warms. The patterns, she said, they come from far back, from my grandmother, who got them from her grandmother, who got them from her grandmother. No one knows where they begin. They're just there, like the mountains, like the rivers, like the stars. Every pattern has a name and a meaning. This one here, she said, pointing to a star-shaped pattern. That's called Staua Diminezi, the morning star. You weave that into cloths for newborns, so they always have light, even in the darkest night. And this one here, an interwoven band that repeated endlessly. That's Drumulwiecki, the path of life. You weave that into wedding cloths, so the path of bride and groom is long and never loses itself. She told me how she gets her colors. From plants, she said, from the earth, from what the forest and meadow give us. Red from madder, yellow from onion skins, blue from woad, green from nettles, black from walnut shells, which you boil for weeks until the water's as dark as night. Each color smells differently, she said. Red smells of earth, yellow smells of autumn, blue smells of rain, and black smells of patience, because it takes so long to make. I asked what weaving had taught her, and she placed her hands on the cloth, tenderly, as though stroking a child, and said, "Every thread has its place. That's what I've learned. When you weave, you see it. Every single thread is important. If one's missing, you notice. If one's in the wrong place, you notice that too. But when every thread is where it belongs, then something whole emerges, something beautiful, something stronger than any single thread alone. And it's the same in life," she said. "Every person is a thread. Every day is a thread. Every memory is a thread. And when you weave them together, patiently, row by row, then a pattern forms, the pattern of our life. And it's always beautiful," she said, "even if you don't always see it right away. You just have to step back and look at the whole." She got off at a village whose name sounded like a prayer, rolled up her cloth, adjusted her headscarf, and walked across the dusty platform, small and upright, with the confident steps of a woman who'd walked the same path from kitchen to loom and back for 60 years. Every thread has its place. I think of that when the world seems chaotic, when everything's mixed up and nothing seems to fit. Then I remember her cloth, the patterns that only become visible from a distance, the morning star shining in the darkest night. The train carries on, and the rattle sounds like a loom. Clack, whoosh, tap, clack, whoosh, tap. And my eyes grow heavy, and I feel the threads weaving together. Memory upon memory, thought upon thought, until a pattern emerges, soft and warm. The pattern of this night that wraps around me and holds me and carries me. I met the old man with the Dachshund on a train from Hamburg to Lübeck on an early November evening, when all the leaves had already fallen from the trees and the sky had taken on the color of pencil strokes. It was one of those train journeys where the windows fog up and you can't see much beyond vague shapes and the blur of passing lights. The man sat directly opposite me with his small brown dog on his lap. The Dachshund was already asleep, its head resting gently against the man's chest, breathing steadily and softly, like the tick-tock of an old pocket watch that hasn't stopped in decades. The man himself was tall, with white hair that looked like burnt wool, and his eyes showed they'd seen a great deal. Whole platforms full of people, trains coming and going, seasons passing like the scenery in the window. He held his dog as though he were carrying the most precious thing in the world, and there was something in that gesture so calming, so still, that I found myself breathing more slowly as well. His suit was a practical dark brown, well worn, and on his lap lay a folded dog blanket, a faded color, washed many times over. It smelled faintly of detergent and of something else, of years, of routine, of love repeated. I asked him what the Dachshund's name was, and the man smiled so gently, as though I'd asked him how he'd planted his whole life, what roots he'd sent down into the earth, what flowers had grown from them. The dog, he said, was called Amos, and he was now 16 years old. 16 years. That's a long life for such a small dog. The man told me that Amos followed him along the same route every day, always Hamburg to Lübeck, twice a week, for more than a decade. 150, 180 trips a year, multiplied by 10 years or more. 1,000 journeys together, 1,000 times along the same rail crossings, the same bridges, the same sequence of village and forest and river. You couldn't really imagine it, the man said. How many trips there had been. How many times they'd traveled this way, Amos and he. The dog had learned every bend in the line, every station, every voice of the conductors, every scent of the seasons as they passed the windows. Sometimes, when the train pulled into Kiel, Amos would open his eyes for exactly 5 seconds, sniff with his black nose, and then fall asleep again. It had become a habit, the man explained, a ritual between him and his old companion, something only they two understood. The dog knew this route the way one knows one's own bed, the way one knows the rhythm of one's own heartbeat. I asked him why he made this journey so often. The man looked down at Amos, his face soft in the weak light of the compartment. He said he was retired, a former railway worker, and for many years he'd worked on this very line. Now he traveled to be united with the train, not as a worker, but as a passenger, with Amos. The dog was his reason for making the journey, but the journey itself, that was his reason for still being alive. He said it without any drama. It was simply the truth of an old man who'd learned that the meaning of life can be as small as the warm nose of a dog in your hand. The trains, the stations, the pauses between stops, the quiet, that had become his prayer book. We sat there for quite a while without speaking, and I watched the man gently stroke Amos now and then, very lightly, as though he were touching something precious, something that might slip away. He whispered something into the dog's ear, something so quiet I couldn't hear it, just the murmur of love. But I saw Amos's tail twitch ever so slightly, even in sleep, an unconscious answer. The dog felt the tenderness, even while dreaming. The dog knew this man loved him, had loved him his whole life, and that this love wouldn't end as long as either of them could draw breath. I thought about how many people are lonely on their travels. You see them everywhere on the trains, with their mobile phones, their books, their headphones, all completely alone in a compartment full of people. They stare out into the darkness and see nothing, really. They dream of things far away. But this man was never lonely. He had a companion, small enough to hold, old enough to understand, old enough to have patience, old enough to make the journey something sacred. The Dachshund wasn't just a dog. He was a purpose, a rhythm, an answer to the question of why a person gets out of bed in the morning and begins the day, why this man was still alive, why he still believed the world was worth seeing, that Lübeck was wonderful in every season. Just before Lübeck, Amos woke up, not fully, but enough to stretch, to extend his 4 little paws against the man's lap. The man pulled a dog biscuit from his pocket, slightly stale perhaps, but neatly wrapped in paper, and Amos ate it very slowly, very deliberately, as though he understood that this was an important moment, the last thing before arriving, the small reward for patience, the little sign of Amos's loyalty accepted. I asked the man how much longer Amos would travel with him. The man looked at me with his old, wise eyes and said, "As long as needed, as long as Amos could still enjoy the journey, as long as his heart still beat, as long as he still had this blanket and this lap reserved for him." And then he too would scatter his ashes along this line between Hamburg and Lübeck, where Amos had spent his whole life. The dog would become part of these trains, would travel with every carriage number, would still be there whenever the train ran this route. He said it without sadness. It was old. It was wise. It was the voice of a man who'd learned that life is a circle, that parting and being together are the same thing. The man stroked Amos's warm head, and the dog lay still, warm and heavy in his lap. The train slowed down, and through the windows I could finally see something again. Lights. Lights from Lübeck, emerging from the darkness like stars just being born. The man stood up, lifted Amos gently into the air, held him against his chest, and whispered to him again, tenderly, lovingly. And I saw in that moment how truly old the man was. Not in his face, not in his eyes, which still shone like fire, but in the way he held his dog, as though he were cradling a child falling asleep, slowly, very slowly, forever. The train came to a stop, the doors opened, and I remained in my seat and closed my eyes. The lights of Lübeck blurred behind my eyelids, and I heard very faintly the soft sound of paws on the platform, very light, very quiet, like the tapping of history. An old man and his old dog walking together into the night, bound forever to this journey, to this place, to this love. And I lay in the darkness still, and my eyes grew heavy and warmer, and I heard only the rattle, soft and far away, and everything faded into the rhythm of the train, which would run again tomorrow evening, and always, and always. I met the young woman with the pram on the line from Dortmund to Münster, on a March day when the sun begins to warm the earth again, and the sky takes on that particular pale blue that only spring knows. She sat opposite me, and in the pram slept a baby, not more than 4 weeks old, I'd say. The child was perfectly still, its tiny little hands resting on the pale pink blanket, and the mother simply stared out as though she were seeing a window for the first time in her life, or as though she'd forgotten what they were. I could see from the way she sat, from her dark, red eyes, that she'd slept very little, probably far too little. The mother of a newborn is always tired. That's not a criticism. It's simply a fact, like rain or gravity. She hadn't combed her hair, and that wasn't unhygienic or careless, but only honest. The truth of someone who gives everything for another person. She wore jeans that were far too large, clearly from before the pregnancy, and a shirt that belonged to someone else, a gray pullover that probably belonged to the baby's father. Her feet in her shoes seemed fragile, hovering, as though she no longer knew how to stand, how to walk, how to be a person outside the pram. I asked her how old the baby was. She answered only 4 weeks, and her gaze returned immediately to the window, as though the outside world were pulling her like a magnet. It was that sort of answer that told me 4 weeks felt like 4 years to her, that every day was unbearably long, that every night lasted an eternity, that the nights were like deep wells from which she couldn't climb out, where she only fell and fell. I recognized that. I'd once taken my daughter home from hospital with a newborn, and I remembered that first night, that first week, how I woke every hour, how I checked if the baby was still breathing. You think you're going to die. You don't realize that it's normal. You think you won't survive, but you do, and the days go by, and one day it's 4 years later, and you sleep again. The baby was breathing very quietly. One breath, then a pause, then another breath. Sometimes newborns check their own breathing, their own existence, and it's as though you're watching a person discover themselves. The mother looked out the window, but her hand rested on the pram all the time. She needed the contact. She needed to know the child was still there, that it hadn't fallen away. I told her it would pass, that the exhaustion won't last forever, even if it feels that way now. That one day the baby would sleep, and she could sleep too, all the way through, 4, 5 hours at a stretch, without checking whether the child was still breathing. And that would feel like the greatest invention in the world, like the first sunrise after a night that went on too long. The young woman smiled, but it was a sad smile. She said, "I can't imagine that. I don't know how to sleep anymore. I've forgotten how." She said it like a joke, but it wasn't. And that was the truth. It's always the truth with new mothers. They forget who they were before. They become a different person. And that isn't always easy, accepting this new self. I told her it was the most beautiful thing in the world, walking this path. That she'd never have this moment again, this exact weight of the child in the pram. That one day the child would be grown and wouldn't need the pram anymore, and the woman would think, how quickly that went. That she would keep these moments, even the most painful, the most exhausted, the most desperate ones, later with the sharpness of a memory, like keeping a picture you look at when you're old. The young woman didn't really nod, but I could see she heard my words. Maybe she didn't believe them, but perhaps she'd remember them later, in the night when the child was older, and she'd think, that old man was right. The train rattled over a bridge, and in the movement, the baby woke up, opened its eyes, which were bright blue as spring air. The mother was immediately attentive again, leaning forward, and the baby looked at her, and then the child smiled. Or no, it wasn't a smile. It was only an expression on its face, a twitch of the corners of its mouth. But the mother saw it, and her whole body changed. She came alive again. She became young again. "It's not really smiling yet," she said to me, and her voice was completely different now, alive, like an instrument that had started to play again. "It's just a reflex. Scientists say it's just chance." But her eyes were shining. They shone like a window with a great fire burning behind it, a fire that could chase away all the exhaustion in the world. She wasn't pointing out her baby's smile because she wanted to share a scientific fact, because she wanted to speak the truth. She just wanted someone to see that this smile existed, that it was real, that it belonged to her, that she, this exhausted woman in the pullover that was far too large, had made this smile, that she was a mother, that she wasn't just tired, that she was also something wonderful. The baby looked at her for another moment, then closed its eyes again, and the mother leaned back. But now she wasn't tired anymore. Now she was something else. She was a mother protecting her child, who stayed awake every night because she needed to know the child was still breathing, who had no problem with the sleeplessness because she knew she would do that forever for this little bee. She asked me a few questions. How many children I'd had, what it was like when they grew older, whether it got easier. And I answered honestly. It becomes different. It doesn't get easier. It simply becomes different. The nature of the love changes. The body sleeps more, but the heart never sleeps. The heart of a father, a mother, never sleeps as long as the children are on this earth. The train approached Münster. The sky outside grew brighter. March rolled past with its first warm rays, and the fields turned green. The young woman looked out but didn't see it. She was absorbed in her baby, in the rhythm of breathing, the mystery of this small life. And I was satisfied knowing I could see that I could know that somewhere in this exhaustion, in this darkness, a woman loved her child. The train slowed as we neared Münster. The young woman prepared herself, picking up the pram, packing the bag that was full of nappies and cloths. And I watched her take the little baby, hold it against her chest, very gently, very securely. And then she disappeared with this child, this young woman who barely knew how to sleep anymore, but who knew how to love. And I remained alone in the compartment, and the train took its way again. Rattle, rattle. And my eyes grew heavy, and I thought of all the mothers who were awake in the night holding their children, who would never sleep because they knew that was the most important work there was. I met the vicar on the line from Trier to Koblenz, on a train running late at night, when everyone else is sleeping and the windows show only darkness. He was sitting 2 seats away from me, and his table, his compartment, his whole area was completely covered with little note cards, small colored papers, yellow, pink, white, mint green, scattered about like confetti. He was writing constantly with a ballpoint pen, and his face had that concentrated expression you see when someone is trying to solve a great puzzle, trying to catch something that keeps slipping away. The man was probably mid-60s, with gray hair neatly combed the way a German would comb it, and he wore a black suit with a special collar, a clerical collar, which told me he was something religious, a priest, a vicar, a man of the church. His hands were old and ringed, but not tired. They moved with the certainty of someone who's made the same movement his whole life, writing, thinking, correcting, writing. The pens on the shelf beside him were worn, the paint rubbed away at the edges, some used down to half their length. It told me he worked this way daily, that these cards and these pens were the tools of his life. I asked him what he was writing, and he looked at me as though he hadn't noticed me before, then smiled. A very tired smile, but genuine. The smile of a man who's worked long. He said, "I'm writing a sermon. I'm always writing a sermon." And then he showed me the cards, this whole mountain of colored papers. It was a sermon on forgiveness. Or no, not on forgiveness itself, he explained to me carefully. It was a sermon about what remains when you forgive. The scar, the knowledge, the way you become a person who is forgiven, different from before, more fragile, but also stronger somehow. He told me he'd already written this particular sermon 7 times. 7 times. On 7 different nights, in 7 different trains, with 7 different pens. And each time it was different. Not the story was always the same. A story from a parish, a man, a woman, a quarrel, a chance for reconciliation. But the way you arranged the words, that changed. The first draft was too harsh, too judgmental. The second, too soft, too sentimental. The third, too long, people would fall asleep. The fourth forgot the important points, the spiritual ones. The fifth, sixth. And so he wrote and wrote and wrote through this night on this train until the sermon took the shape it needed, the shape that could open hearts, or at least make people think, help them be a little better than yesterday. I looked at these little cards, these notes, these fragments of thought, and tried to read them. Suffering is a path, not a destination. Forgiveness is an act of courage, not of weakness. You can close your heart and it will be safe, but it will also be a prison, and it will be dead. The scar shows that it is healed. Sentences he kept writing, kept reformulating, writing, until they were exactly right, until they held the truth he struggled to put into such simple, such profound words. The vicar told me that the work of a vicar was writing sermons, that he had to write a new sermon for every Sunday, 90 sermons a year, many hundreds in his lifetime, that he had to struggle with himself every time anew, like a man fighting the same enemy who keeps disguising himself differently, that he had to try to say things that are unsayable, things that are bigger than words, that he had to try to comfort people whose lives are destroyed, people who are grieving, who are suffering, who are lost. And the only thing he could do was write words, only words, small colored cards with words on them. That was his craft, that was his life. But, he said, sometimes these words changed something. Sometimes after church, a woman would come to him with tears in her eyes. Your words helped me talk to my son. We hadn't spoken in 5 years, but after your sermon, we talked. Or a man would say, I asked my wife to forgive me because you showed me how to be humble. And then the vicar would know that the little note, the little yellow card with a few sentences, that this card, these carefully found words, that they had changed the world. Not the whole world, but one person's world. And for one person, that is the whole world. That is all that matters. One person who was helped. The train continued through the darkness, and I watched the vicar at his work. He was lost in the words, in the search for the right phrasing, like a man searching for water in the desert. His lips moved as he wrote, as though he were speaking the words so he could hear how they sounded, so he could feel whether they were right. His voice in his head, checking, correcting, rejecting. A very old trade, I thought. The trade of words, the trade of making invisible things visible, making God visible, making hope visible, making love visible. I asked him whether the sermons were hard to write, whether he ever felt that he knew enough, that he was finished, and he answered slowly, every time I write as though I were writing for the first time. Every time I'm uncertain. Every time I ask myself whether the words are right, whether they're enough, whether they help. But it has to be this way. It must be this way. If I was certain, I'd grow proud, and pride is the opposite of humility. And a vicar must be humble, or he's no longer a vicar. He's just a man who speaks, a man with words, but without God. The train slowed as we neared Koblenz. The forest outside grew less dense. The lights of small villages appeared. The vicar arranged his cards carefully. He gathered them all these little colored papers with his thoughts, his struggles, his formulations, and put them carefully into a brown envelope. It was like a ritual, and I knew that these words, these carefully found, carefully formulated words, they would speak to people on the next Sunday, people sitting in pews and listening. And perhaps one person, just one, would find something in these words that would change their life. A quarrel would be reconciled, a heart would open, and that would be enough. That would be everything. The vicar stood up. and his case was small and dark, worn from use. He nodded to me, like a man who'd shared a long night, who'd shared his thoughts. And as I watched him step down from the train, with his brown bag full of notes, his whole work condensed into colored cards, I thought, this is what it means to take your work seriously. This is what it means to live with words, not to play with them. This is what it means to believe in something bigger than yourself. And I was tired, and I wanted to sleep, and I closed my eyes slowly. And the train rattled on into the night. And somewhere, a sermon would be read, would be spoken, of words that an old man on a moving train had labored over for hours. I met them on the line from Stuttgart to Nuremberg, on a winter morning when the sky was still dark and the world looked frozen, with that particular stillness only early winter has. A father and his daughter. She was perhaps 18, 19 years old, at that age where you're no longer a child, but not quite grown. And they had a large black case with them, a violin case. A very good instrument, an expensive one. You could tell even when it was closed. The father sat beside her, and I could see how nervous he was. His hands trembled a little. They kept trembling. And he kept glancing at his daughter, checking that she was still there, that she hadn't run away. The daughter simply stared out into the darkness. She was silent, completely silent, not a word. She wore a dark dress, elegant and new, and her hair was neatly tied back, and there was something formal about her, as though she could already see herself on a great stage, as though she could already see herself as an artist. The case beside her had been checked, I'd guess, 100 times, perhaps 1,000. The father had checked it when they got on the train. The instrument was precious, not in the sense of expensive, though it surely was expensive. In the sense of valuable, in the sense of everything depends on this instrument, in the sense of if this instrument were damaged, his daughter might not be able to play, and if his daughter couldn't play, she wouldn't have a future. I could see it clearly in his eyes. That was his worry. That was his whole life, resting in this black case. I asked them where they were going. The father answered slowly. My daughter has an audition, a music conservatory, a great conservatory. She has a chance of being accepted. It's a wonderful opportunity for her, the kind that doesn't come often. His voice was proud, very proud, but also tense. Tense like a string pulled too tight, ready to break at any moment. And the daughter said nothing. She simply said nothing. She looked out the window into the darkness and waited. What could she have said? There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said. I recognized this silence. I know it from my own children. It was the silence of someone standing on the edge of something important. It was the silence of someone who knows his fate, who knows that his life could change in the next 2 hours. Or perhaps not. Perhaps she wouldn't be accepted. Perhaps the judges would say, "That's nice, but not good enough." Perhaps she would be a person who was almost good enough forever, but not quite. Perhaps she'd just end up with a normal job in an office like everyone else. This possibility hung in the air between father and daughter, like an invisible ghost, and both of them knew it. Both could feel it. The train rattled on through the darkness, and I watched the daughter more closely. Her profile was very still, very concentrated, like a marble statue. But I saw her lip tremble, only very slightly, only for a moment. A tiny betrayal of her nervousness, a tiny crack in her facade of absolute calm. And I thought, this young woman is carrying the weight of the whole family on her shoulders, not because the parents want it that way, but because she feels it. Because young people feel such things. They feel their parents' hopes like a physical weight sitting on them, pressing them down, suffocating them. And they can't speak against it, can't say, "This is too much." Because it's love that holds this weight. and you can't reject love for your parents. That would mean ignoring love itself. The father wanted to talk to me about his daughter. Perhaps he just needed to talk to someone about her. He said that since she was a child, she'd played violin. Since she was 6 years old, 16 years, half her life given to the violin. He himself didn't play, but he loved music with a passion I could understand. He and his wife, they wanted their daughter to be an artist, to do something great, not just have a normal job, an office job, something ordinary. That was his dream for her, his deepest dream. That she would be one of the best players, that she'd play in grand halls, in concert halls, with orchestras, that people would sit and listen to her music and weep when she played, that she would be immortal through her music. And the daughter? I looked at her for a long time, but I couldn't see what she was thinking. She looked out the window and her face was completely calm, completely still. I couldn't see whether she shared this dream, whether she also dreamed that people would weep when she played, or whether she simply played because she could, because she was used to it, because she didn't know how to stop, because her father wanted it, and her mother and the whole family had put everything on this one moment. This daughter wasn't just a daughter. She was the family's hope. She was the way out of the ordinary, the everyday, the mundane. The father asked his daughter, "Are you nervous?" And she answered, without turning, "No." But I saw her hands. Her hands trembled. They trembled exactly like her father's hands. They were nervousness and fear. They were also music. They were the hands that would play the violin, the hands on which everything rests. I remembered my own daughter when she was young, also a musician, also the family's hopes. She wasn't as talented as this young woman, but the pressure was the same. And I remember one day, a few weeks before her big performance, I saw her weeping at night. She was sitting on her bed and she was weeping, and she said, "Papa, if I'm not good enough, if I fail, what then? Who am I then?" And that broke my heart, because I realized that I'd given her a monster. I'd given her an identity that was completely bound up with her music. And that was unfair, that was cruel. And I said to her, "You are more than your music. You are my daughter, and you are already good enough just because you live, just because you breathe, just because you exist. The music, that's beautiful, but it's not everything. You are everything." And I wondered now, watching this music student, has anyone said these words to her? Or is she carrying the weight without knowing it doesn't have to be carried? I said to the father that it's all right to be nervous, that nervousness isn't weakness, that nervousness is a sign you're doing something important, that my own daughter, when she was young, was also nervous, terribly nervous, that everything truly important brings nervousness with it, that you know you've given much when you grow nervous, when you've given everything, every hour, every day, for years. The father nodded. He heard me, but he also didn't really hear me. He was lost in the thought that Nuremberg was getting closer, that the audition would soon be here, in 2 hours, or 3. Time was strange when everything was at stake. The daughter didn't open the violin case. She left it closed. She wouldn't practice on this train. She wouldn't check that the strings were still there, that the wood hadn't cracked, that the bridge was still upright. The instrument was ready. She was ready. Or not. But there was no way to prepare by playing 1 more hour, by going through the same passages 1 more time. There was only to arrive, to play, to give your best, and to see what would happen. Whether the judges would believe she understood the music, whether they would feel that this young woman had something to say. The train slowed as we neared Nuremberg. The sky was now gray, a winter gray, and the lights of the city appeared like promises. The father stood up, and the daughter stood up too. She took the violin case, That was the first time I saw her hands weren't trembling. She took the case and she held it as though she were carrying her whole future, which perhaps she was, this violin. As I watched them step down from the train, I thought, this is what courage is. It's not being without fear. It's walking with the fear. It's taking your instrument and going out into the winter sky, not knowing what would happen. And the father followed his daughter, and I saw that his hand lay on her back, very light, very gentle. A father who didn't know how to help, so he just held her. That's all a father can do. That's all that's needed. I met the lonely businessman on the line from Duisburg to Essen on a late train when the sun had long since disappeared below the horizon and the world knew only darkness, a gray, endless darkness. It was autumn, October perhaps, and it was raining outside, lightly, steadily, like a mantra, like a prayer that never ends. The man sat opposite me, and he was tired. Not the normal tiredness of someone on a long journey, the kind that sleep erases. No, the tiredness of a man who has been tired his whole life. A tiredness that sits deeper than the bones. A tiredness of the soul. He was perhaps 50 years old, perhaps older, it was hard to say. He wore a good suit, gray, very neat, very elegant. The sort of suit you wear when you want to be important. But the collar wasn't quite right. His hair wasn't freshly done. And his eyes were empty. Empty like an empty office after closing time, when there are only bare desks and nobody comes anymore. He held a laptop in his hands, an expensive MacBook, but he wasn't typing. He was just staring at the screen without really seeing what was on it. A working man on a business trip, a traveling salesman. There were millions of these men in Germany, tens of thousands daily on the trains, all alone. I asked him where he was going. He answered mechanically, without blinking. Essen. I'm going to Essen. Just those 4 words. Then he looked back at his laptop, but his eyes were vacant. I asked if he was from Duisburg. No, he said, from Munich. But I travel everywhere, every day. I drive to customers, city to city. I'm always traveling, always, for 25 years. And with those words, I saw very clearly that he wasn't really happy. That he wasn't proud to travel everywhere. That it no longer fascinated him. That it made him tired, infinitely tired. That it had destroyed his life, not all at once, but slowly, piece by piece, year after year, until nothing remained except this man in a gray suit on a train. The traveling was his job. The trains were his life. He sold something. Machines, perhaps, or software solutions. Something the world needed, but few wanted. And he drove from office to office, city to city, sold his product, took orders, or didn't take orders. It made no difference. It was always the same. Duisburg to Essen, Munich to Hamburg. Always on the train, always tired, always alone. I remember, the man said, and his gaze grew distant for a moment, that I loved this work. At the beginning, I was young, perhaps 30, and the travels were like adventures. Every city was new, every customer was a new challenge, every conversation was interesting. And my family understood. My wife, she supported me. The children were still small, and they missed me, but they were proud of their father, who traveled the world, who was successful, who made money. But the years passed, and slowly, the adventures became routine. The routine became prison walls. The man fell silent for a long time, and I heard only the rattle of the train. He told me, very calmly, without emotion, that he had a family, a wife married 20 years, and 2 children, 18 and 20 years old. They live in a beautiful city, Munich, in a house with a garden. A good life, you'd say, a successful life. But he's never at home. He comes home late, after 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, sometimes even later. The children are already grown, they're gone. They're studying, they're working, they're no longer there. The wife waits for him with food on the table, but the love, it's cold long ago. There's no conversation anymore, there's just food on the table and silence. And then he goes to bed, alone, in his own house, and the next morning he leaves again. Duisburg, Essen, Cologne, Hanover, always on a train, always alone. I asked him very directly why he did this, why he didn't just take a different job, a job that would keep him at home, a job that would give him more time with his wife. And he looked at me, and it was as though he wanted to weep, but without shedding tears. His eyes developed red rims, but the tears didn't come. He said very quietly, "I'm too old to change everything. I'm 55 years old. I'm too old to learn a new job. I'm too old not to travel. The traveling, that's my life. That's all I know. That's all I can do. If I stop, who am I then?" And I saw he was speaking the truth, that this man had spent his whole life on trains since he was 30 for 25 years, that he no longer knew how to be at home, that the trains were his home, that the rain outside was his life. The train rattles on through the darkness. The rain falls outside, steadily, like the heartbeat of the train itself. The man doesn't open his laptop. He writes no emails, no messages, nothing. He just looks out into the darkness, into the black night, and I know he's thinking, tomorrow I'll travel again, to Hanover, the day after tomorrow as well, to Cologne perhaps, and next week, and next month, and next year. And that's how my life will be until I die. A life on the train, a life of traveling, a life where I'm always going but never arriving. The train is his fate. The journey is his prison. I tried to speak with him once more. I said, "It's not too late. You could change your life. You could be a different person starting tomorrow. You could wake up and say, 'No, I'm not going. I'm staying at home. I'm a father. I'm a husband before I'm a businessman.'" And the man looked at me, and his gaze was empty, completely empty. "You don't understand," he said slowly. "It's not about courage. It's not about choice. It's about reality. I'm trapped in this machine. I'm a part of this system. If I stop, everything collapses. My family, the house, the debts, everything would collapse. I'm not free. I haven't been for a long time. I'm a wheel in a machine, and the wheel cannot stop turning." I said to him, carefully, that it's not too late, that he can see his family, that he can stop, that there's always time to stop. And he answered, but without hope, without even a whisper of hope. No, I can't. The bills are too high, the house is too expensive. It was always expensive. The children's schooling costs money, and now they're at university, that costs even more money. I can't stop. The money is everything. That's the only thing that matters. The money pays for the house where my wife waits, the house I never come home to. And I understood suddenly, very clearly. I understood that some people are trapped not by others, but by the world itself, by necessity, by the bills, by the fact that we all have to work to live. That work is both our prisons and our churches. Just before Essen, as the train slowed and the lights of the city appeared, the man packed his laptop away. He stood up, very slowly, like a man with old bones, a man who'd lived a century. He took his case, a gray case, which looked as worn as the man himself, with the same scratches and dents, the same tired gray. And as he stepped down from the train with his case, his suit perfect, but his eyes empty like two dead windows, I thought, this is what it means to be successful. That you lose everything except your job. That you have a family but don't know who they are. That you're rich but poor. That you live but don't exist. And I was very tired, and I wanted to sleep, and I closed my eyes slowly. And I heard the rain outside, still falling, still there. And I thought of all the businessmen traveling on trains, alone, always alone, never arriving, trapped on trains forever. It was the smell that woke me. Not a sound, not a voice. A smell. I was sleeping at a station on the line from Ulm to Augsburg on a train that was slowing down. I was sleeping deeply, dreaming of nothing, and then the brakes hissed. They hissed for a long time. The wheels squealed and squealed, the train slowed, and then came this smell, this sweet, warm, intense smell of freshly baked bread, of real bread, of bread that had just come out of the oven, still fragrant. The aroma penetrated the compartment like an invisible hand, touching me gently, waking me, asking me to get up. I opened my eyes slowly. The sun had just risen. It was early in the morning, perhaps 6 o'clock. I didn't know where I was. I slept every night on a different platform, on a different train, but I knew where this smell was coming from. I knew this smell. I'd smelled it 1,000 times in my life. It was the smell of a station bakery, a small bakery right at the platform that baked small loaves and rolls daily early in the morning for the travelers, for people like me, for people who travel on trains. I stood up from my seat. It was early in the morning, the sun just at the horizon. I took my purse. The train would be here for another 10 minutes. 10 minutes was enough. I could go quickly to the platform, find this bakery, and what? Buy a loaf? Yes, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to buy a warm loaf, still warm from the baker's hands. On the platform, the air was cold, but the smell was warm. The smell was everywhere. It came from the station building. I followed it like a dog that's caught a scent. And there it was, a little shop with a red door, and in the window were loaves of bread, golden, crisp, tempting. And beyond, through the glass, I saw the baker. She was an older woman, gray-haired, and she was just wiping her hands on her apron. I stepped into the shop. The smell was now overwhelming. It was not just bread, it was butter mixed with flour. It was warmth coming from the oven. It was time. It was memory. It was all the years I've been traveling. It was all the people I've met, whom I've forgotten. It was my mother. She smelled exactly like this when she baked bread, many, many years ago, when I was still small, when the world was still safe, when there was still such a thing as home. The shop itself was small, almost cramped. There were only 3 or 4 tables, and on the walls hung old photographs, black and white photographs, yellowed and scratched. I saw pictures of people standing in this bakery with loaves in their hands, generations of customers, decades of stories. And I understood that this place wasn't just a bakery. It was a sanctuary, a place where time stood still, a place where people came to remember home, childhood, love, moments that mattered. The baker saw me, and she smiled. She said nothing. She knew why I was here. A traveler, a man on a train, who had woken to her smell, who had come to buy. She took a loaf from the basket, a loaf that had just been finished, that was still warm. She wrapped it in paper, not plastic, old paper, brown paper. The warm loaf steamed a little, and as she wrapped the paper around the loaf with slow, deliberate movements, she said something. Not to me, to herself, or perhaps to the bread. "This batch was perfect," she said softly. "Perfect as always. 9 in the morning, the same oven, the same dough recipe, for 40 years. No change, no improvement, just continuity." I paid. It was cheap. It was very cheap for a loaf that was made with such love. The woman gave me the bread, and she looked at me, and I saw that she understood. She understood that this smell wasn't just bread. That was memory. That was time. That was life. That was everything that matters. A loaf that's still warm, a memory of mother, a moment of peace on a train, on a journey, in the middle of the night. "Do you come past here often?" asked the baker. Her voice was home to me, soft, warm. "No," I said. "I'm rarely at this place. I travel a lot, on trains." She nodded as though she'd already known. "The train," she said. "That's hard. Long nights, cold windows, no family around you. I understand that. My husband, before he died, he traveled on trains too. He was a conductor, and when he came home, he spoke of the smell of the station, of the people passing by, of the loneliness, and at the same time the connection. That's the paradox of travel, isn't it?" I nodded. I couldn't speak. The tears came, not dramatically, but quietly, like rain. She saw my tears and she smiled. She said nothing. She already knew everything. She went to the kitchen, and I heard her there for a while, and then she came back with 2 slices of warm bread and some butter. She sat across from me at the small table, and we ate the bread together in silence. And that was enough. That was more than enough. An old woman and an old man sitting in a little bakery at the station in a city whose name I've forgotten, sharing a loaf and a moment of humanity. And I knew that I would never forget this, that I would keep this love in my heart for the rest of my life. I walked back to the train, the warm loaf in my hands. I ate the bread very slowly. I ate it as though I were eating it for the last time. Each bite was different. The crust was crisp with a little salt on it. The inside was soft, very soft, warm, full of life, full of air, full of light. And each bite brought me back to my childhood, back to my mother, back to the time when I was still young, to the time before I started traveling. And I wasn't sad, not really. I was grateful, so grateful for this smell, grateful for this little baker, whoever she was, who still bakes every morning early for the travelers, for people like me, for people who are on their way. The train departed. I watched through the window as the bakery grew smaller, and then it was gone. But the bread was still there, and the smell was still there, and the baker, her voice, her eyes, her hands that wrapped the paper around the loaf, all of that was still there. And I understood that this is the real reason we travel, not to see places, but to meet people, to collect moments, to realize that everywhere in the world, at every station, in every village, there are people who show their love in the only way they know. And this baker, she didn't know that she gave me a gift of home, a gift of time, a gift of mother. The train traveled on. The bread was gone. Only the memory remained. The smell was gone, but it wasn't really gone. It was in me. It was in my fingers, in my mouth, in my soul. And I closed my eyes, and I was with my mother again. And she was baking bread, and the aroma filled the house. And I was small, and the world was sweet and warm. And I heard the wheels of the train. But they weren't the wheels of a train anymore. They were the rhythm of baking, the rhythm of love. Ta-dum. Ta-dum. Into sleep. The clicking woke me. Not a single sound, but a rhythm. Click, click, click. The sound of the points on the line from Hanover to Braunschweig in the deep night. I lay in my seat under my blanket in that half-sleep, and I heard this sound. Click, click, click. Over and over. Rhythmic, hypnotic. It wasn't unpleasant, no. It was soothing. It was like the heartbeat of the railway, the pulse of the train, the rhythm of the journey. The sound of millions of people traveling every day, every train, every place in the world. The points are the places where the rails divide. The train has to cross them, has to choose the fork, has to take its way. And when it does, when the train rolls over the points, there's this particular sound. Click. A short, sharp sound, metallic, hard. And then, a few seconds later, again, and again. Sometimes quick when we pass a station with many points, sometimes slow when the points are further apart. That night, we were moving slowly through flat land. The rain fell outside, lightly, steadily. The points clicked slowly. Click. Long pause. Click. Long pause. Click. A metronome, a pulse, a timer. Evidence that time is still passing, that the world is still turning. And I lay in my bed, not sleeping, not awake, in that strange half-state you only find on trains, where the outside world is so far away that the inner world begins to open up. I thought, while I listened, while I counted the rhythm, about the people who built these points. The workers who labored in the cold, who welded these rails together. The engineers who calculated every curve, every gradient. The people who created this whole world of travel, who gave the possibility of moving from one place to another, from one life to the next. Without their work, I wouldn't be sitting here, wouldn't be traveling this night, wouldn't be listening to this music, wouldn't be hearing the rhythm of the points, wouldn't have this quiet. This night would be empty, and I would be even lonelier. And I wondered, did these workers, did they ever get on a train? Did they ever travel on the rails they themselves built? Or did they work their whole lives, not knowing that their hands gave freedom to other people? That's a strange kind of love, isn't it? The love of work, the love of structure, the love that's given without gratitude. The rhythm changed sometimes. Sometimes it was faster when we passed a larger section where there were more points. Sometimes it was slower when we drove through a plain. The train adapted. The body of the train followed the infrastructure. The rhythm followed the earth. And I followed the rhythm. I was a part of it, a passenger who was listening. And in this half-sleep, in this darkness, I began to understand that I wasn't alone, that all these workers were with me, that all these engineers had given me a gift. And I was grateful. So grateful for every single click, for every single moment when the train moved forward, when the wheels rolled, when time passed and I was carried along, safe, held by the love of other people I would never meet. There was deep beauty in this sound, not fleeting, not superficial, a deep, sustaining beauty. The beauty of routine, the beauty of work that was done year after year, night after night, decade after decade. The beauty of engineering, of planning, of precision. A system that worked. A network of rails that kept people connected. A rhythm that held the whole country together. With this sound, with this clicking, with this one simple, perfect tone. There was a point in the night, perhaps 2 a.m, perhaps later, when the rhythm changed. We passed a larger station, a junction where many points came together, and the rhythm became chaotic. Click, 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 click. The train slowed and the rhythm became unpredictable. And in that moment, I lost my inner compass. I no longer knew where I was. I no longer knew who I was. The certainty I'd found in the steady rhythm was gone, and I was lost again. Back in half sleep, back in that half state between life and death. But then we left the station. The rhythm became regular again. Click, long pause. Click, long pause. Click. And I was safe again. And I understood something in that moment. Life is like that. Most of the time it's regular, predictable, calm. But sometimes it becomes chaotic. Sometimes you lose your way. But then order comes back, and you're safe again, and you can breathe again, and you can hope again. I didn't fall asleep again. I stayed awake and listened. Click, click, click. The train went on into the night. The points clicked. Hanover lay behind me. Braunschweig lay ahead. And between those two cities, on this line, in this night, there was only this rhythm, this sound, this clicking. That was the music of traveling. That was the prayer of the train. That was the song of the rails. That was the language of the night. That was all that mattered. Click, 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 again and again. And as I listened, as I lay in half sleep, as the night passed, I began to dream. Not dreaming with my eyes, but dreaming with my heart. I dreamed of a train that travels forever, that never arrives, that never has to stop. A train that simply, eternally, travels through tunnels and over bridges, through fields and forests, always onward, always deeper, into the night, into truth, into mystery. And I began to think, that's what we overlook, isn't it? In this modern world with our mobile phones and our attention deficits, we overlook this music, this simplicity, this truth. One sound, one rhythm, one movement, and a story that tells itself in that sound. A story of human endurance, of human creativity, of humanity's ability to understand nature and work with it, not against it. The clicking of the points isn't just a noise. It's evidence that humanity has managed to connect the world, not by force, but by patience, by wisdom, by love. The night passed. The points clicked. The rain fell. The lights of villages shone in the distance. And I lay in my seat, warm under my blanket, and I heard click, click, click. The sound of the world moving, the sound of time, the sound of something that never stops. And I was grateful for it. Grateful for this sound, grateful that I was here, grateful that I was allowed to travel. And you know, in that moment, while I listened, while I felt the rhythm, I knew that this is the meaning of life. Not success, not fame, not even love in the romantic sense, but the ability to listen, the ability to understand the moment, the ability to be grateful for the gifts that were given to you by people you'll never meet in times long past. That is life. And that is enough. And as the first light appeared on the horizon, as Hanover approached its end, as Braunschweig grew closer, the points didn't stop playing their music. Click, click, click. And I would still be listening, would still be grateful, would still understand that beauty lies in the small things, in the rhythm, in the clicking, in the ta-dum of life, which goes on, which never stops, which carries us all into sleep.